Hi everyone, my name is Amy Johansson and I am an adjunct faculty in the psychology department here at Cal Lutheran University. Today we're going to be talking about effective coaching and counseling techniques. We're going to go over a couple of tasks and techniques that can be used in order to provide good financial services. So before we start the lecture, I want you to take out a piece of paper and a pen, and I want you to think about why it's important to be a good counselor when you're providing financial services, and also what makes you a good financial counselor. So just take a few seconds and drop down your thoughts, and then we'll get back to that later on in the lecture. Okay, so let's start the lecture. So, one thing that's really important to remember is that coaching is important, but listening is even more important. And we have to remember that listening is a really powerful tool that can be used in everyday life, including when you're doing coaching and counseling. It basically makes your clients feel heard. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I'm also going to be going over some basic techniques that can be used when you're doing some financial counseling or just counseling in general, or even when you're talking to people in everyday life. And another thing that's important to remember is that developing trust is really important when you're doing any type of counseling, really. The clients are coming to you because they're having some issues, money-wise, financially, so you want to make them feel safe. And in order to make them feel safe, they have to trust you. It's really hard to trust someone that you don't feel safe with, someone that you don't feel understand you. So developing trust, that trust is really a really important tool. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the counselor as a person and professional. So first I want to focus on the relationship between the client and the counselor. So the relationship is a really important component to effective financial counseling. And if you don't have a good relationship, it would make it really difficult for the client to trust you. So just like I mentioned earlier, you really want to develop that trust. It's really important. And you want to make the relationship into something that's warm and comforting. And so you want the client to feel safe. And if you're warm, you don't necessarily have to have a warm personality, but just letting the client know that you actually care about them is really important. Okay, and then the counselor as a person is a key part of the effectiveness of financial counseling. So basically, being a counselor is not a job, it's more about who you are. So your personality is actually really important when it comes to any form of counseling. When you don't have your client's best interest in mind, they're going to find out, and they want to know that you're actually caring about them. Okay, so now let's talk about the effective counselor, and some characteristics are really important in being a good counselor. So the first point here is being authentic. So by this, I am referring to being real and being yourself with your client. Even though I am in the psychology department, I work for the psychology department, it's a really important aspect of counseling in general. So being yourself and letting the client know that you actually care about their needs. If you are not yourself and if you're not being honest with them, very quickly they will find out, and it's something that you kind of can sense. So I would really encourage you to be as real, as authentic as you possibly can. Okay, and then the next one is empathy. So empathy is another really important component in counseling. So there is a difference between empathy and sympathy. So I want you to think just for a few seconds about what the difference actually is. So when we're talking about empathy, we're talking about the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Sympathy, on the other hand, is referring to your ability to feel sorry for someone, to feel for someone. Being empathetic is a really powerful tool because it communicates to the client that you're actually understanding where they're coming from and understand their concerns. Okay. It's also important to be very supportive and be very genuine with your client. If they are trying to figure out what to do with their finances, it's important to be very supportive of them and not necessarily trying to push them towards a decision, but letting them know that you're here and that you will accept them no matter what decision they make. So being supportive is a really important aspect of counseling. Another thing that is really important is that you have to be present. And even maybe you're talking to a friend, you're talking to your partner, many individuals find it difficult to kind of stay present and stay in the moment. And so now we're kind of coming back to the concept of listening. So when you're present, you're also listening to the client. And when you're not present, the client will know. So sometimes, and this happens to all of us, our mind drifts off and we're having a really hard time focusing on what the other person is saying. Sometimes when we're having a conversation with someone, we think about what we want to say next instead of actually listening to the person and being present. And it is important to focus on the past and the future, but also the present is a really powerful tool. Okay, which brings us to the next point, which is listening. So listening goes hand in hand with being present. If you're listening to your client, you're basically letting them know that you're hearing what they're saying, you're hearing their concern or concerns, you're listening to their problems, trying to really understand where they're coming from. And again, it's very important to utilize this tool and being there, being present, and actually listen to the client's needs. Okay, so now let's talk about some general values in regards to counseling. There are a couple of points that I wanted to bring up that are really important. One is persuasion. So when you're doing any type of counseling, it doesn't matter if it's psychology or if it's financial counseling, you want to make sure that you're not trying to persuade your client to do something that you want them to do. So what you want to do is to guide them towards the right direction. So they're coming to you for support, they're coming to you for maybe some financial advice, and you might have an opinion about what you want them to do in a particular situation. But just remember that being a really great counselor is not necessarily about persuading them or convincing them of doing something, especially when it comes to a client's finances. Money can be a very sensitive issue for a lot of clients, so it's important that we're being sensitive. And so we don't want to necessarily convince them to do something that they're not comfortable to do. We can help them lay out the facts, point out the pros and cons of a certain decision, but again, it's not really our job to convince them to do something in particular just because we think they should. Okay, and finding answers that match a client's values, that's also really important. So to demonstrate this, let's think of a hypothetical situation. Let's say that a client comes in and they are considering giving all their money to their sister. And let's say that you in your personal life, you don't have a very good relationship with your sister. And so naturally, you're probably going to think that this client is out of their mind, that this is a decision that they can't make and you have to do everything in your power to convince them not to. But we have to remember that we have to meet our clients' needs. And so we have to find a way to not impose our own values onto the client. Even though you might not have a good relationship with your sister, it doesn't mean that the client doesn't. And so it's really important to not let your own values get in the way and your own beliefs get in the way of helping the client and doing what's actually best for the client. Right, so the next point is providing answers and advice to the client. Even though our clients come to us because they are looking for an answer or they're looking for advice, it is really important to remember that we're not necessarily there to provide advice and give them the right answers. And there's a reason for that. There's actually a really good reason for that. So our clients come in because they're struggling in some aspect of their life. When you're doing financial counseling, most likely their issues or their concerns are going to be related to money. And so I want you to take a moment to just think about what are some problems with telling the client or advising the clients what to do with their money. Just take a few seconds and think about that. Okay, so let's talk about it. There is a really good reason why we don't want to. Even though we are financial counselors, it's not our job to actually provide the answers. Reason being is that, well, there are a couple of reasons. One, it's more empowering for the client to come to that conclusion themselves. So it kind of gives them a sense of empowerment and decreases the likelihood of them developing a dependency on you. So they might feel more accomplished if they come to a conclusion about what to do in a specific situation in regards to finances. They might feel more confident in solving the problem on their own later on, so they don't feel as dependent on asking for help from someone. But also, another thing that's really important to remember is that if we're providing answers and giving advice to the clients, it actually gives them a reason to blame it on someone if something were to go wrong. So let's say that you're advising them to do something with their money and things didn't really go as planned and they ended up losing a lot of their money. So they're going to come back to you and they're going to blame you for losing their money. So that is another reason to be careful with actually answering questions and advising clients to do certain things. Okay, and the next point is focusing on the client's goals. So the first thing you should be asking a client is, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the end goal? And so your job or our job as counselors is to help them set up a plan to accomplish that goal. And we have to remember that it's not our goal, it's our client's goal. And so we can help them reach long-term goals by helping them set up short-term goals in order to reach that long-term goal. And this is something that a lot of individuals are struggling with. Usually they know what their long-term goal is, but they're having a hard time setting up short-term goals in order to reach that long-term goal. Okay, so I did want to throw in a couple of cultural considerations in regards to counseling. It's a really important aspect of any type of counseling, really, no matter if you're doing psychological counseling or coaching or financial counseling. So one thing to keep in mind are cultural differences. So some financial decisions may be based on some cultural values. So as counselors, it's our responsibility to just be aware of that and make sure that the clients feel comfortable with us, even if we might have different cultural values. But we have to accept our clients' cultural values and provide the best services we can despite that. Okay, and then in regards to biases, it is really important to be aware of our own biases. And what I mean by that is that some of our biases might not even be aware of them. And so let's say that you for some reason have developed a negative bias towards a specific cultural group. It can be based on demographic information, ethnicity, for example. And so being aware of these cultural biases is important in order to be an effective counselor. And then you have to ask the question of, is this something that you can overcome? Or is this something that you definitely cannot work with? Maybe you're not the best financial counselor for them. And so it's really important to be aware of our own values and our own biases in order to provide the best services possible for our clients. Okay, and the historical background, traditions, and values of the client are also important factors to keep in mind. Don't be afraid to ask the client about their historical background. Don't be afraid to maybe even go on your own time, do some research about the client's culture. In some cultures they put family first, and so sometimes if they're making money, if they have a job making money, it is because of their culture, they're sending money to extended family in a different country. This is maybe something that you're having a hard time understanding, and so being able to listen and be open with your client and being open-minded is really important. And finally, try to understand the world from the client's perspective. So this is where empathy comes in. We need to use that tool in order to try to understand where the client is coming from. So there's always a reason why people do what they do. There's always a reason why they make certain decisions in regards to their finances. So our job is to try to understand those reasons and being there and being supportive for our clients.